What's up, tribe? How y'all doing? So happy to be here with you guys today, coming from Joshua Tree, here where both Seth and I live. An amazing little town full of artists and creatives and mystics and entrepreneurs. And on that same theme, I'm very excited to be here with my brother and friend Seth Cassidy, who is an astrologer. He's an Eastern astrologer, which is called Vedic astrology. It's one kind of Eastern astrology. Western astrologer, Zen practitioner, probably many other things that I don't even know, but very excited to have him here. And he's going to be sharing some wisdom. We're going to be talking about what Saturn Return is, what you can expect going through Saturn Return, why it's happening. Many amazing things. You know, I know so many of us have been through it, are going through it, or perhaps about to go through it, maybe even for the second time. There are multiple Saturn returns that take place in a person's life if we stick around this planet long enough. So we'll be talking about some of that as well. So very excited to get into it. And yeah.
Thank you for having me, man.
Seth
I really
Cassidy.
appreciate it. Yeah. This is cool. It's a good honor to be here. And I look forward to exploring this with you and hearing your take on it too, and sort of your relationship to Saturn Return, why you decided to label or name your record that, and get into a little bit of the intricacies of Saturn Return, what it means, and how one could navigate that period.
Yes,
wisely.
Exactly. Yeah, wisely. Yeah, that's the goal. You know, just speaking from my own experience, when I was going through my Saturn Return, I met an astrologer. He was still a good friend of mine who lives here in town, and he said, you're about to go through your Saturn Return. I said, well, what's that? And he kind of explained it to me and said more or less what I might expect. And I was like, oh man, this is going to be interesting. Yeah. And sure enough, it was a mind-blowing time. So many things in my life kind of crumbled at that time. So many things that I thought were like the underpinnings, the foundations of who I was or how I knew my life to be, all fell apart. Parents split up. I'm an only child, so it was like kind of a traumatic thing. Even though I'm an adult, it's a very weird thing too. It's like, wait, what? My parents are splitting up. Like, for sure. I didn't expect that, And my band fell apart, and career changed, and moved cities twice, and so many things happened. But I was blessed enough to at least see it coming and know that I was coming into a time of big transition and what some of the themes were around that. But I know many people didn't get that, may not even be aware that that's coming down the pipe. So can you explain a little bit about, first of all, what is Saturn Return? What's taking place? Why do they call it Saturn Return?
I think to answer that question, we kind of have to explore what Saturn is first.
Sure.
And that's a good starting point, because the energies of Saturn come into focus, you could say, at that time, maybe at their fullest capacity or their fullest expression around the time of Saturn Return. So I understand Saturn as a principle, even a force, maybe you could call it, of contraction and limitation. So basically, it's a force or an influence that tends toward like a pullback, like making, like if things condense and constrict and restrict and get limited. You can kind of understand all the expressions of Saturn from that fulcrum. Saturn is likened to a lot of, like the brake pedal, essentially, in life.
Oh, really?
And whereas I think of Mars as maybe the gas pedal, Saturn's more the brake. And this extends all the way down to the very foundations of the material world. The material world, in its solidity, if we could call it that, has a lot to do with the condensation of matter. It's like the slowing down of vibration to the point where things become more concrete. And so all the way at the very the fundamental level of the reality we inhabit, you could say this principle of Saturn is alive and well, that this kind of contraction aspect to it, the slowing effect. So Saturn then is related to the material world. It's the sort of where the rubber hits the ground, the concrete reality, the separateness of things, the world of duality, the world of matter. And so it's not just that. It's that principle of contraction, limitation, and slowing within the material realm that's been created by that same principle too. So you're looking at things like delays, things like frustration, you kind of facing the inertia of the material world. So Saturn imposes limits and structure and restrictions. That's what it's known for primarily. And it's more or less the rub of maybe our energy or our efforts or our actions against the inertia of that material dimension. And Saturn is known to be the great teacher for that reason, because our maturity develops as we come to terms with the limitations and maybe you could say like the slow pace of time and the restrictions of space and of having to what it means to get something done in the material world. So there's kind of these two sides to Saturn. Like if you really want to understand its significations, I think on the one hand it's the nature of reality itself, which is got these restrictions of time and space, right, and of the like I say, the inertia of the material world. But then it's the qualities of an individual that are developed to work with that nature of the material world. So things like patience, self-discipline, prudence, that sobering realism that comes from facing things squarely. So there are many more things. I mean, self-discipline, responsibility, hard work ethic, all these things are ruled by Saturn. And so when Saturn return comes around, it's kind of a reality check. It's how well have you been living in accordance with reality? How well have you cultivated some of those qualities of Saturn? And a lot of that comes to a head, and it is really a crossing of the threshold into adulthood as far as astrology is concerned. You don't become an adult at, say, 21 or 18, as our laws would say. It's really once Saturn
when we're old enough to drink and fight in wars.
Yeah, well said. Yeah, so it's Saturn takes 29 and a half years roughly to go around the entire sky, right there around the heavens, back to its original place at the time when you were born, so its natal position. So for all of us, Saturn return occurs right around the age of 29 and a half. And so by that point, Saturn's had the chance to go through each of its roughly 2.5 year transits of every house in the horoscope.
I see. And
Saturn being this reality principle, which sort of concentrates lessons to be learned where we're facing reality squarely and kind of rolling up our sleeves to get dirty and learn things, even karma, the karma that we're facing in a particular domain. As Saturn transits each house, we're learning the lessons of that house, so by the time it gets all the way back to its natal position, it's had a chance to go through every house in our chart. So in a way, that's a transition, or at least a rite of passage, you could say, of having reached a certain point of maturity. And then depending on how we've lived up to that point, Saturn return can be experienced as the slap in the face of reality.
Yeah,
I'd
say so. Yeah.
Or it can be, if somebody who's prepared well and has integrated a lot of the positive traits of Saturn into their lives already. It could be a time of maybe, like the bearing of fruits that have been well prepared for, or something like that. But nonetheless, it's definitely experienced by a vast majority of people as a time of growing up, getting real, and in a sense, facing the limitations of one's life. That can be the limitations of oneself, so you can experience one's mortality a little bit more soberly, and also the limitations of what you can realistically accomplish in this lifetime. And so where you may have had a huge plethora of options and choices and ideas and dreams and so forth going into Saturn return, by the time you go through Saturn return, all of that gets condensed down to maybe the most realistic of options. And so that can be depressing in a sense, but it can also be liberating, because now you know better who you are, and you also know you kind of have this freedom that comes from only having a few options as opposed to just an endless amount.
Right.
So restrictions can be liberating, in the Saturnian way.
Right. clarity, I guess, is kind of what it comes down to, like a condensation. It's interesting how you describe it that way, and the matter and just limitations.
Yeah.
It seems like that's part of maturity, is being more in the world, right? And knowing how you fit into things, how you're contributing to the world, what the world's giving back to you, how to do that, how to handle that and interact in a healthy way.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a condensation of skills.
Mm-hmm.
Like you're saying, Saturnian skills, and some of those, like you were saying, patience and self-discipline and all these things, having those tools in your toolkit and how sharpened they are will inevitably make that an easier time as that condensation is taking place. That's what it sounds like you're describing.
Yeah, it's very well said. Yeah, for sure. There's a condensing effect through the Saturn Return passage in that sense, and it is giving you those skills at the same time, hopefully to make you face reality. The more we face reality, the more we're sobered up, the more we face the limitations of life, and also maybe even so Saturn's also associated with our karma too, and that's the effects of our actions within the sphere of time and space and causality, and so karma can come back to us at that time too, and that can also give us a blast of reality. So the maturity aspect is this, I agree, I think it's the integration of a lot of the Saturnian principles in our lives in the positive sense. And, just growing up, I mean, you know how it is when you're a kid, you dream of anything. There's no limits, right. And part of growing up and maturing, I think, has to do with this, the cultivation of Saturn's principles through Saturn's lessons. And that comes typically not through joy and pleasure, but more through the rub, of
pressure,
you versus
challenge.
You against the world kind of thing.
Yeah.
And that's how Saturn gets this reputation of being the great teacher and also the great malefic. Most people don't. Saturn gets a bad rep for being kind of like
the hard ass.
The hard ass. Yeah. Yeah, the one that people fear, right. And it doesn't necessarily need to be so. I think with the right perspective, if you can appreciate why there are limits and why there is this rub, why it's challenging to get things done, we can't do it overnight in a second. We have to apply ourselves and be patient and work hard for it. Mm-hmm. If you can get to that point where you appreciate Saturn, I think Saturn is not seen so much as a malefic influence, but as an awakener.
An awakener. I love that term. I think that's definitely been my experience. And perhaps you can speak to your own experience, but going through it was very much about awakening to, or perhaps even reawakening might even be a way of putting it, but awakening to who I am as an adult, who I am in the world, in the most authentic sense, and in a focused way. I think that focus was a big part of it for me. It kept coming back, in my case, to authenticity, feelings of authenticity. Is what I'm doing authentic? Is it feeling in alignment with not only my dreams and my visions, but like you're saying, like what I feel like I can achieve and I can give in a very real sense. So yeah, perhaps you can speak to some of your own experiences with it.
Yeah, it sounds like you went through a clarification of who you are in that passage.
Yeah.
And again, those limitations of what you can and can't do. So that sounds very Saturn Return like. Mine was similar. I will say too, and maybe we'll get to this. I know you may ask about like how a Saturn Return may be different for different people.
Yeah. I do want to get into that.
So yeah. I won't go into that yet, but I think maybe the defining, and I'll tell you maybe more about why mine was the way it was, but the defining feature for me, I think, was definitely that whole passage of growing up and facing, the reality of my own limitations and getting real. But for me, I have an aspect in my chart between Saturn and the Sun, and as I'll describe in a moment, when a planetary aspect or configuration is present in a person's natal chart, in a sense, Saturn's passage over Saturn triggers that to come up as well. Right. So it brings it into greater focus. And it also, so yeah, I won't go into that now, but there's the flavor of mine was kind of realizing that I wasn't being fully true to myself as well, and authenticity sort of thing.
Really?
Yeah, very similar. And I think it's funny, my wife moved in with me on the exact conjunction of Saturn on Saturn to the minute.
No kidding.
That was,
to the minute.
To the minute. Yeah, like, you have degrees, right? Like
right.
Degrees,
yeah.
and then like there's a little minor minute tick, 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 right? So like that alignment came to the minute on the day when she moved in. So it was clearly a defining starting point, I guess you could say, a new beginning for me. And of course, Saturn return isn't only the day of the conjunction. It's said to last, 2 years, 2.5 years, roughly. Yeah. And Saturn can make multiple passes going retrograde over natal Saturn too.
Right.
But within that, 3 degree on either side of Saturn, and Saturn's a slow-moving planet, that whole period can be felt as one Saturn return. So for me, there was definitely the whole period was characterized by this growing pressure to... So a lot of it is, this is another facet of Saturn return, is that, up until this point, we've kind of been living in our parents' reality, or the reality we've been born into.
Right.
And so Saturn return is often seen as a threshold where you sort of begin to stand on your own 2 feet in your own reality and own who you are and how you want to live the next 29.5-year cycle.
Right.
So there's this sort of letting go process as well of the things that maybe are not a good fit for you and you don't want to carry into that next 29.5-year cycle. And for me, there was definitely that pressure to like start figuring it out. What is mine? What is theirs? What was I born into? And so it did precipitate not only the start of this relationship that later became my marriage, but it kick-started a whole process of self-examination and the rooting out of what wasn't me, ultimately landing me back on the West Coast to move completely and sort of leave my childhood heritage behind to embrace who I was more on this side of the country.
Interesting. Okay. So
yeah,
a big move of change of location. Sounds like, was there a career change as well at that time, or?
There wasn't a career change. There was a job change. I mean, there was a letting go. I had been working actually for 5 years in a school that was my own elementary school.
Really?
Yes, I went back and got a job there. And for those 5 years, I was kind of in the comfortable nest of what was familiar to me, and I definitely felt that I wasn't going to continue to grow in that space. I needed to do something to expand outward and test myself in new ways. So there was that growing pressure, and so yes, there was a job change and a move and that kind of thing that's part of it. There was a relationship that ended prior to meeting my now wife. So there was definitely some sorting of what was and was not going to stick around, and there, I can't remember it in total clarity. I think there was definitely a period of like, probably insecurity and going through periods of vulnerability and just feeling uncomfortable in my own skin even. Yeah. What's right side up and right side down. I didn't really know during that period, but for the most part, it was a constructive phase of almost rebuilding my life on new terms.
That sounds about right.
Yeah. For you too?
Yeah, very similar things. Yeah, very similar things. I can really relate. Relationships.
Yeah.
Kind of a string of relationships that weren't healthy, and realizing that, being like, I need to take a step back. And
relationships are often a vulnerable thing in Saturn return, because we're growing up and and Saturn's giving us that reality check. And so the key things in our lives, career, relationship, home, the fulcrums of our life, all kind of subject to scrutiny at that time.
Right.
So that seems to be a pattern that most people experience. That I think I read a statistic about the number of divorces that tend to happen around this time. Is much greater than at other times.
Right. Yeah, that doesn't surprise me.
Or separations if you're not divorced.
And that kind of brings me to, I guess, jumping ahead actually a little bit, but to my second question, which is the second Saturn return. It's not talked about as much, it seems like, most of the time it's focused on that initial Saturn return where you're the coming of age and those things you and I just discussed. But what about the second Saturn return? Because as we continue to increase our lifespan, we're living longer and longer. More and more people are making it to their second Saturn return, which I would hope that they would. But it's certainly not a given in life. But if you do make it there, first of all, when is the second Saturn return, and what themes might come up perhaps at that time in someone's life versus, let's say, when they're 29 and a half?
That's a good question. So it happens around 58, because 29, 58-ish. And so that's the short answer of the timing. It's a little different for everybody, but roughly around that time. The pressures would probably be a bit different in the sense that, and I'm not an expert on this, I think I'm not 58 yet, so I haven't gone through it myself. I can speak to Saturn return earlier a little bit better, but I think if I were to surmise, I think the first one is a bit more of that rite of passage of stepping into your own authenticity or to your own life a little bit more. Whereas the second one maybe has a flavor of, have I been living, up to this point the way that I should have been? Almost maybe a reflective, sobering, like at 58, you've got less time left, you could say, at that point. So you have to, I think, hunker down and figure out, are there any adjustments that I still need to make at this point to really carry out my dharma, as they would say in Vedic astrology, and do what I've been put here on earth to do. So there can be the midlife crisis effect that can come around that time.
Right.
And again, relationships, jobs, everything are back up on the table for scrutiny. And I think that's another crucial point. There are people that will go into it deeper in terms of the exact nature of that threshold and maybe what it's ultimately really about. And I'd have to ponder that a little bit more. But yeah, it's a definite maturing time in its own right. Just qualitatively different than the pushing away from childhood, and maybe more for maybe looking ahead now as to how do I want to finish this journey.
Right. More focused on legacy, perhaps, and
perhaps even that. Yeah.
What you're leaving behind and what you've contributed so far, and is that in alignment? Is there work that's been missing that still needs to be done? And
for sure. Yeah. Saturn transits of all sorts all have that tenor of getting practical and getting real.
Right.
The sobering up of reality, squaring up with reality. So, and Saturn on Saturn. For the record, too, Saturn rules teeth and bones. I mean, you could look at the physiological symptoms of that, but typically, teeth and bones might come into focus. People might get teeth filled. And,
I didn't know that. That makes total sense, though. I mean, so from just people that I've, parents, relatives, friends who I've kind of seen going through their second Saturn return, a lot of those themes tend to come up.
Yeah, you can watch for it. I think, again, the pressure to do something, the pressure to sift through what is and is not me, and just really reflect on the things that are and are not working, I think seem to be the nature of Saturn transit, specifically Saturn with Saturn over Saturn, because then you're just getting the full archetypal force of Saturn itself. But Saturn, in an aspect by transit to any other, inner planet particularly, would trigger the reality check related to that particular planet's energies. So you're still getting, what I'm saying is the common denominator is this sort of sobering up reality testing. And so, the Saturn returns in particular seem to be these defining chapter changes.
Right, that makes sense. So, as an astrologer and somebody who has knowledge, at the very least, about what's taking place, and what these qualities are of Saturn and how it may fit into your particular chart, and we'll get into that here shortly, but how has that benefited you with, let's say, your own Saturn return, with, the effects that Saturn's had in the different houses in your chart, knowing, okay, Saturn's coming into this house, this is what I'm going to expect, but how has that knowledge helped you do something about it? And what wisdom can you share from that experience?
Do you mean Saturn transits in particular, or do you mean transits in general, like being able to forecast the future?
Saturn-related transits.
Saturn-related transits. Yeah. I mean, I'm trying to remember where my headspace was at prior to Saturn Return. I definitely had it on my horizon and knew I was going into it. Mm-hmm. I actually didn't discover astrology until I was 28. Okay. So I was
just
given the gift, just as I was already in it.
Right.
Which, by the way, is connected. I mean, here I am doing astrology, and so in a way, the 28, 29, 30 years were times of trying to use astrology actually to try to make sense of who I was and how I was different or unique in my own. We're all unique in our own ways, and
for sure.
How do I take that knowledge and then start to live differently according to it? So I shouldn't overlook the fact that astrology came into my life around that time too, and it did the reality check in its own right. But yeah, I think, just in general, knowing your transits is extremely powerful. I mean, it's very, it allows you to understand archetypally what would be expected at any given time in your life. Mm. And so not only can you mentally prepare for it, and maybe even acquire some tools to help make it go a little smoother. I can give you examples in a minute. But also just to kind of understand, especially when you're in the thicket,
right?
to get some perspective and see the light at the end of the tunnel.
Right.
You'll know that this is expected to last XYZ duration of time. This is what I'm supposed to be learning at this time. This is what all the textbooks say is expected at this time.
Right.
It gives you a healthy degree of detachment, I think, from yourself and whatever you're going through. And it also gives you the capacity to maybe extricate some meaning from it all too. Mm. And I think that's a real crisis in our day and age, is this sense of meaninglessness that we don't necessarily feel so connected to the cosmos, or that life has a purpose. Mm. And so I think astrology does serve a wonderful role in that, to help you not only connect yourself again with the larger cosmos, but also see that we are life unfolds according to these sort of patterns and according to these archetypal principles, and the more we understand them, the more we can make the best use of a particular period or transit's energies. So an example, as I was saying, would maybe be like if Saturn was coming into a alignment with a natal, like Venus, for example. That would be like a relationship transit or oriented transit. And I might buckle up and be prepared mentally for okay, this is going to really test my relationship. Yeah. And, depending on what other transits are going on at that time, you might say, I'm going to need some, I'm already starting to see the rumblings, or I can already see where there might be some vulnerable areas in this partnership. Why don't I take some proactive action now and start lining up a therapist? Or I might, get some communication tools that I practice, and maybe we outline how to talk better, or something like that.
Be proactive.
Be proactive, yeah.
Yeah.
So I would say it's a Saturn in particular. I think there's other Saturn transits I could speak to, not just Saturn over Saturn, but Saturn over my ascendant and so forth was also a very potent time. And knowing those things were going on, I think, was very liberating to me. It was just, not only did it restore my faith in a sense, because it was like, wow, there really is synchronicity between all this, and it's almost,
this is really happening.
Yeah, it's according to its own divine plan, and I felt myself connected to that. So that restored a spiritual faith at the same time. But it also gave me some perspective that this was it's not forever, and this will, all things will pass, and this is one of them. So yeah, I think that's it's very helpful to know what house Saturn is in, too.
That's what I was going to ask is, okay, so let's say, like in my case, I was born on March 19th. I'm on Pisces, cusp of Aries. Mm-hmm. And so when Saturn's coming all the way back around, how do I figure out what sign Saturn's in when I was born? Is that just, do I need to get my chart done to, like, really see that? Mm-hmm. And is it different depending on where Saturn falls, or where it was when I was born exactly? Can you speak to that a little bit?
When you said Pisces Aries, you're talking about your sun sign?
Yes.
Okay. So just for clarity's sake, when people say, like in Western astrology,
right.
I'm a Pisces or I'm an Aries,
yeah,
they're just simplifying the whole chart,
okay.
and I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm just
sure.
saying that's our convenience, the language we speak. And Western astrology is a very solar chart. The sun is at the center of it all,
right.
and so whatever sign the sun is in gets to be your sign.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Now, what most beginners to astrology don't realize is that you have a whole chart. You don't just have the sun, and the sun is not given as much attention. I shouldn't say that. It's just not as prioritized. It's not singled out as the most important element in a chart in the Vedic practice, Vedic astrology. More of a lunar-based system. And they go by rising sign and the moon and so forth. But they're dialing in on things that are a little more time sensitive, that are because everybody born within a 30-day window all has the same sun sign.
Right, right.
So I think to answer your question, you can't really discern where Saturn is placed in your chart just based on your sun sign.
Okay.
You can Saturn is based on the year of your birth more than the month of your birth.
Okay.
So if you're skilled enough to kind of know what signs for 2.5 years Saturn was in given years,
right.
I could say, oh, well, you had Saturn in that particular sign.
I see. So born in 1985 or whatever, you can look it up and see where it was.
Correct. You could do that much, but if you're going to go through all that effort, you might as well just get your chart.
Just do the whole thing.
Yeah. And you don't have to go to an astrologer for that. You can go to astro.com and you can just look up your chart.
Okay.
They have free horoscopes there, and you can just type in your birth info, and it'll pull up your entire natal horoscope.
Right.
And then from there, you could figure out how Saturn is, and you have to know the symbol for Saturn, and it gets a little complicated if you're totally new to astrology.
Sure.
But the house placement of Saturn is going to color the nature of your Saturn return. So and then the other thing too is Saturn an aspect to any planets in your chart? Is it forming one of the key angles that are treated as aspects? Okay. Meaning, is it in opposition to a planet? Do you have a planet 180 degrees away from Saturn when you were born?
Right.
And if so, then Saturn's transit over Saturn's going to, like I said, for my case, Saturn and Sun, it's going to trigger that theme of whatever Saturn opposite Sun means to come up.
Okay. It's all very complex. I mean, the more you get into it, for sure, which makes sense. I mean, that's also the nature of the cosmos. The forces are very complex, and it's so many planets are orbiting at different times, at different speeds, at different angles.
Right.
There's a lot going on there, and these, the way that I think about it, and perhaps you can speak to this a little bit, is, I mean, I've always been somewhat on the fence, or at least I used to be, about astrology. I was like, okay, cool, my sign, etc., cool, but I was like, is this real? Is this like a real thing, or is this kind of just a way of trying to explain our lives based on the stars?
Yeah.
But when I think about it in scientific terms, just the gravity of our planet alone, just the gravity of the moon, which is a fraction of a planet, how it affects the tides, how it affects all life on Earth. Just that one thing, for something like Jupiter, which is whatever, like 350 times the size of Earth, it's like the amount of gravity and pull and all the, the speed at which it's spinning and all these things, these forces are just insanely powerful. They're so strong. They're beyond our full comprehension, I think. So it only makes sense to me that when I think about it in those terms, that these things are really taking place in our lives. And then once you experience it, when you see it coming, you're like, whoa, this is exactly what, it seemed like they're saying is going to take place during these years with, like, let's say Saturn Return or whatever, various transits that take place. It's a real thing. And so, I just wanted to just kind of put that out there because I was a bit of a skeptic, perhaps I would say. But no longer.
Well, yeah, I think it helps if you, for the more materially minded of us, and most of us have been, I would say, indoctrinated into this culture that is very skeptical of anything metaphysical, and the metaphysical influence of something like a planetary body on us is a stretch from the scientific perspective.
Right.
And it's okay to have that skepticism. I think it's good to have the bullshit meter up.
For sure.
But with that said, I think it's a good starting point, as you've just articulated, that if the moon has a physical effect on things like the tides and whatever, okay, well, then we have at least a causal connection between a planetary body and life on Earth. That's a good starting point.
Sure.
That doesn't necessarily mean that, therefore, they can affect our psyches and our emotions and everything like that. I mean,
sure.
So it is still a leap of faith to go from physical effects, gravity and things like that.
Sure.
And I think the only way you really build faith in that, and I was a skeptic. I've been a skeptic my whole life. I didn't believe in astrology at all up until 28. It's not like I was born into a family that was like, just told me this is the way things were, and I believe it. I didn't even know what a horoscope was. I mean, really, until I was 28, and my ex-girlfriend at the time got me a reading, and I was blown away by it. I couldn't believe how accurate the reading. It wasn't your superficial Sunday newspaper horoscope of you're gonna love nature, or you're gonna have a fun weekend or something. It was down to the very specific dynamics of my life.
Yeah.
And the only way that I have built faith in this system is just through seeing chart after chart after chart and transit after transit, and living it with the knowledge at my fingertips